Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Well, it is great to be back at Drake University. I am so grateful to all of you for taking the time to be here. I want to thank Quentin for his service to our country and for his wonderful introduction. He may not have mentioned, I couldn't hear outside whether he mentioned this, but he's getting married tomorrow. So he needed permission from his soon-to-be bride in order to do this, and we're very grateful to him, but I told him he better get out of here quickly afterwards and take care of whatever needs to be taken care of. So we congratulate him on that. I want to thank everybody on the campus, the entire Drake community, for inviting me to speak today. In particular, I want to thank Aaron Gardner, who's our Drake neighborhood organizer. Where's Aaron? There he is, right there. Thank you, Aaron. We've also got some Bulldogs for Barack, who are a very active organization on campus, and I'm grateful to all of them for the hard work that they're putting in. And finally, if there are those of you who are interested in getting involved in the campaign, obviously I want all of you to caucus for me. And one thing I know is when you come to Iowa, you've got to ask people to caucus for you. So we've got supporter cards here, and afterwards, if any of you are interested in getting involved, we would love to have you involved. Today's focus is going to be on foreign policy. So it will be a slightly narrower talk than I usually give in these kinds of settings, but we have so many important foreign policy issues that are coming up that I think it's important for me just to focus on a few issues related to foreign policy today. I want to start, though. Yeah, we can talk about foreign policy if you'd like. He's excited about it. Let me start by congratulating a great American, Al Gore, for being named this year's winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. I just had an opportunity to talk to Vice President Gore last week because of the work that I was putting in on our energy proposal. He is an extraordinary leader for this country through his many years of public service, his early and vocal opposition to the war in Iraq, and above all, his singular leadership in drawing attention to the global climate crisis. Al Gore has advanced the cause of peace at home and around the world. For that, we owe him a great deal of gratitude, and the award that he received is richly deserved. It was 5 years ago today that the United States voted to give George Bush the authority to wage war in Iraq, 5 years ago this week. At the time, I was a candidate for the United States Senate, and I spoke out strongly in opposition to war. Nearly all of my opponents for the Democratic nomination for president made a different choice and voted to authorize war. Now, some have asked me, why are you reminding us of that opposition to the war? Isn't that yesterday's news? Is that experience really relevant? And what I always say is this: the question of the Iraq War and its authorization isn't just about the past, it's about the future. I don't talk about my opposition to the war to say I told you so. I wish the war had gone differently. But the reason I talk about it is because I truly believe that the judgment and the conviction and the accountability that each of us showed on the most important foreign policy issue of a generation is the best indicator you have about how each of us will make those decisions going forward. How we made that decision back in 2002 and how we talk about it today is critical to understanding what we would do as president. We will carefully evaluate, carefully evaluate the evidence and the consequences of action, or will we skip over the intelligence and scare people with the consequences of inaction? Will we make these decisions based on polls or based on principles? Will we have the courage to make the tough choice, or will we just choose the course that makes us look tough? These decisions aren't just Washington parlor games about who's up and who's down. These are life and death decisions. They impact our safety and our security. And above all, they impact the soldier from Iowa or the airman from Illinois and every single one of our brave young men and women who are in harm's way and all of their families and friends back home. Now, it's easy to oppose a war after it's gone wrong. It's easy to say years later that the war shouldn't have happened, given what we know now about how badly it's turned out. But every single one of us running for president only had one chance to make a judgment about whether or not to go to war. As I traveled around the country, so many Americans asked me, how did we go so wrong in Iraq? And they're not just asking because they want to understand the past, they're asking because they don't want their leaders to make the same mistakes again in the future. They don't want leaders who bog us down in unnecessary wars. They don't want leaders who allow America to lose its moral standing. They don't want leaders who tell the American people anything less than the full truth about where they stand and what they'll do. That is the big part of what this campaign is about, because we need to learn the painful lessons of the Iraq War if we're going to secure our country and renew American leadership. And the first thing we have to understand is what happened in Iraq, because there are two ways to look at this. The first way is to say that Iraq is a disaster because of George Bush's mismanagement, or because of the arrogance and incompetence of Dick Cheney, or Donald Rumsfeld in prosecuting the war, or because Iraq's prime minister hasn't been up to the job. But I take a different view. I think the problem isn't just how we fought the war, it's that we fought the war in the first place. This isn't just a problem of execution, it is a problem of conception. Because the truth is, the war in Iraq should have never been authorized, and it should have never been waged. The Iraq War had nothing to do with 9/11 or al-Qaeda. It was based on exaggerated fears and unconvincing intelligence, and it has left America less safe and less respected around the world. I came to this conclusion in 2002, and my friends warned me not to speak up against the war. Going to war was popular. So was President Bush. You'll be putting a U.S. Senate race on the line, they said. But I just didn't see how Saddam Hussein posed an imminent threat. I was convinced that a war would distract us from Afghanistan and al-Qaeda and fan the flames of extremism and terrorism. And I didn't get into politics to stay silent on tough issues or to tailor my position to the polls. I didn't want to look back after an unnecessary war had been waged and regret that I didn't speak out against going to war just because going to war was popular. So I spoke out against what I called a rash war, a war based not on reason, but on politics. But the conventional thinking in Washington lined up for war. The president and his advisors told us that the only way to stop Saddam Hussein from getting nuclear weapons was to go to war, and that we couldn't let the smoking gun be a mushroom cloud. Leading Democrats, including one of my opponents, Senator Clinton, echoed the erroneous line that there was a connection between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. And we were counseled by some of the most experienced voices in Washington that the only way for Democrats to look tough was to talk and act and vote like Republicans. There's no doubt that President Bush failed us in the run-up to war. But the American people weren't just failed by the president, they were failed by the Congress. Too many members of Congress failed to ask hard questions. Too many members of Congress, including some of my opponents in this race, failed to read the national intelligence estimates for themselves, an intelligence report that was so unconvincing and so filled with qualifications that the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee decided to vote against the war when he read it for himself. Too many Democrats fell in line with George Bush and voted to give him the open-ended authority to wage war that he uses to this day. So let's be clear. Without that vote, there would be no war. Now, Senator John Edwards voted for the war in 2002. He's renounced that vote instead of pretending that the vote was for anything but war. Senator Clinton, on the other hand, has made a different argument. She says that she wasn't really voting for war back in 2002. She was voting for more inspections, or she was voting for more diplomacy. But all of us know what was being debated in Congress in 2002. We didn't need to authorize a war in order to have the United Nations weapons inspections. No one thought Congress was debating whether or not to conduct diplomacy. The headlines on October 12th, 2002 did not read, "Congress authorizes diplomacy with Iraq." The headlines on October 12th, 2002 read, "Congress backs war." Now, in the course of this campaign, we haven't just seen different candidates talk about their votes in different ways. We've seen how different candidates have drawn different lessons from their experience of the Iraq War, and that is particularly pertinent to the current presidential race and the decision-making of the next president. 5 years later, after that initial war, we should have all learned the lesson of that Iraq vote. We should have all learned that you can't give the Bush administration an excuse to wage war. But just last month, the Senate voted for an amendment that raises the risk that we could repeat the mistakes of Iraq. Here's why this amendment, called the Kyle Lieberman Amendment, is so reckless. It opens with 17 findings that highlight Iran's influence inside of Iraq. Then it says we have to structure our military presence inside of Iraq to counter Iran. Recall that the initial rationale for invading Iraq was weapons of mass destruction. Now it is to counter Iraq. It goes on to say that it is a, quote, "a critical national interest of the United States to prevent the Iranian government from exerting influence inside Iraq." Now, why is this amendment so dangerous? Because George Bush and Dick Cheney could use this language to justify keeping our troops in Iraq as long as they can point to a threat from Iran. And because they could use this language to justify an attack on Iran as part of the ongoing war in Iraq. I don't want to give this president any excuse or any opening for war. Because as we've learned with the authorization of the Iraq War, when you give this president a blank check, you can't be surprised when he decides to cash it. Now, among my Democratic opponents in this primary, Senator Clinton's the only Democratic candidate for president who supports this amendment. She said, like she did 5 years ago, that this is the way to support diplomacy. This is a real difference. I disagree. We all know that Iran poses a threat. We do need to mount international pressure to stop Iran's nuclear program. We do need to tighten sanctions on the Iranian regime, particularly Iran's Revolutionary Guard, which supports terrorism. But this must be done separately from any saber-rattling about checking Iran's influence with our military presence in Iraq. We should not be arguing that our troops have to stay in Iraq to counter Iran. Now is the time to end the war in Iraq. Now is the time to start bringing our troops out of Iraq immediately. That's why I have a plan to remove 1 to 2 combat brigades a month so that we can get all of our combat troops out of Iraq within 16 months. That's as quickly and as responsibly as we can do this. The only troops I will keep in Iraq for a limited time will be to protect our diplomats and carry out targeted strikes on al-Qaeda, not sustain combat, not patrolling the streets of Baghdad. And I will launch the diplomatic and humanitarian initiatives that are so badly needed. So let there be no doubt, I will end this war. And it is critical to make certain that we don't have yet another rationale for why we perpetuate this war. Now is not the time to give George Bush and Dick Cheney any excuses to escalate this war. Now is not the time for the Congress to send mixed messages. That's why my position today is the same as when I stood up in Iowa on September 12th and said, George Bush and Dick Cheney must hear loud and clear from the American people and the Congress, you do not have our support and you do not have our authorization for another war. 5 years after the initial vote for the Iraq War, We should have all learned the lessons that the cowboy diplomacy of not talking to people we don't like does not work. We do need tougher diplomacy with Iran. But the way to support tough diplomacy is not to vote for reckless amendments. The way to support diplomacy is to actually pursue it. That's what I've called for throughout this campaign: direct diplomacy without preconditions. As JFK said, we should never negotiate out of fear, but we should never fear to negotiate. And that's what I'll do as president. Not the Bush-Cheney diplomacy of talking to our friends and ignoring our enemies, rather real, direct, and sustained diplomacy. Now, I have, on occasion, been attacked for this position. A couple of months ago, Senator Clinton called me naive and irresponsible for taking this position and said that we could lose propaganda battles if we met with leaders we didn't like. Just yesterday, though, she called for diplomacy with Iran without preconditions. So I'm not sure exactly where she's standing on this issue, but I can tell you this. When I am President of the United States, the American people and the world will always know where I stand. I don't see how we can rally the world unless we have a president who's willing to lead. And I'm not afraid that America will lose a propaganda battle with a petty tyrant. We need to go before the world and win those battles. And as president, I will. You know, the cautious, conventional thinking in Washington says that Democrats can't take these positions, or that we need to say one thing in a caucus and primary campaign, but another in a general election. That's the conventional thinking that said the Democrats had to vote for war in 2002 because there was an election coming up, an election, by the way, that we lost. The conventional thinking says that Democrats can't win elections unless they talk and act and vote like the Bush administration has suggested when it comes to foreign policy and national security. But understand this, I am not running to conform to Washington's conventional thinking. I'm running to challenge it. That's what I did in 2002, that's what I did in 2004, and that's what I will do as President of the United States, because I think the pundits have it wrong. I think the American people have had enough of politicians who go out of their way to look tough, who say one thing in caucus and another in a general election. When I'm the nominee of our party, the choice will be clear. My Republican opponent won't be able to say that we both supported this war in Iraq. He won't be able to say that we really agree about using the war in Iraq to justify military action against Iran, or about the diplomacy of not talking and simply saber-rattling instead. He won't be able to say that I haven't been open and straight with the American people, or that I've changed my positions. And you know what? The American people want that choice. I think they welcome that choice, because I believe that's what's needed in our next president. We have had enough of misguided wars in Iraq that should have never been fought, a war that needs to end. We've had enough of presidents who put tough talk ahead of real diplomacy. And we've had enough of politicians who put power over principle, or of a government in Washington that shuts you out, and of presidents who don't hold themselves accountable. This is about what we stand for as Democrats. But much more than that, it's about what we stand for as Americans. Because there are plenty of Democrats and plenty of independents, and yes, plenty of Republicans out there who are ready to turn the page on our broken politics and blustering foreign policy that's been so commonplace in Washington. That's how we're going to bring this country together. That's how we're going to restore our security and renew our standing in the world, not by shifting with the political winds, but by standing strong in any storm and standing up for what we believe in. I would not be on this stage today if the promise of America had not brought my own father across an ocean. I would not be on this stage if generations of Americans had not fought before me so that the American dream could be extended to someone named Barack Obama. And that's why I've spent my own life fighting for that dream, no matter how difficult it's been, no matter how tough it was to take a stand. And that's why I will always tell you where I stand, and I will always tell you what I believe. And when I am president, that is how we will meet the hard challenges and reclaim the dream and make the United States of America a light to the world once more. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.